I kind of sensed a bit of frustration this morning about where are we going, how do we make this happen, kind of pessimism. Okay, so we're going to start this afternoon in a different place. We're going to step back, look at the big picture, ask ourselves how we can turn ambition into action. And to guide us through that, a little bit of a fireside chat, as you can see. The discussion is going to be led by Stein Mortensholm, who is from the NTNU communications team, and he is going to talk to ACE modeler, member of the IPCC, Jay Edmonds, and also to Helene Muri from NTNU. Stein, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just bring Helene Muri and Jay Edmonds up with me. We'll try to nurture your optimism after this morning session. And we'll do this by, please, Jay, you can sit right here if you'd like. And we'll send you up to the speaker podium, Helene. Yeah. Because you've been challenged to give us a 5-minute presentation with your views based on your work. And then we'll have this fireside chat, as Nisha called it. And if we run out of material, we have little Hannah there, and we'll send her out into the audience. So please, Helene.
Thank you very much. I thought I would tell you a little bit today about the latest special report from the IPCC on global warming of 1.5 degrees. First of all, status of global warming. Well, we're now 1 degree warmer compared to the pre-industrial from our human activities. That means if we're continuing onto this warming trend, we will reach 1.5 degrees by 2040 and the 2-degree target sometime in the 2060s. That means we don't have very much carbon left to emit. We have emitted about 2/3 of the total amount of carbon that we can emit to reach the targets of the Paris Agreement. And we're already feeling the consequences and impacts of climate change on humans and on nature and on livelihoods. So today I'd also like to challenge you regarding the 1.5 degree target versus the 2 degree targets. As a climate scientist, we're always talking about the 1.5 degree targets. Often when we're liaising with the industry, however, I find that they're talking about the 2 degree targets. And I want to make a point that 0.5 degree really matters. Here is a list of some metrics and the difference in the impacts between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. So for a lot of these impact metrics, you can see that it gets 2 to 10 times worse if you're aiming for a 2 degree target rather than a 1.5 degree. And that goes for extreme heat waves, Arctic sea ice, permafrost, loss of ecosystems and species, plants, crop yields are going down. For a 2 degree warming, basically we have no coral reefs left. So really we need to think about all of these things. Yes, energy transition plays a major role in this. So pathways, 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees. So NDCs, if you follow the national determined contributions, you're likely on a sort of a 3 degree kind of pathway. That's not enough, right? So we need to strengthen our ambitions. We need to increase our actions. 1.5 degree kind of emission pathway in terms of gigatons CO2 per year. Well, actually, there's a peak in emissions in 2020. Very steep emission reductions, steeper emission reductions than for a 2 degree target, meaning you need to reach carbon neutrality already in 2050, so about a decade sooner than for a 2 degree target. Last half of the century, you need to have a net removal of carbon dioxide. So you need to be removing more CO2 from the atmosphere that you're putting into it, and quite at substantial rates. So that is the kind of challenge that we have ahead of us. primary energy sources aligning with a 1.5-degree scenario. So this is a kind of optimistic scenario, you might say. So it's aiming for sustainability. So it's a world of global cooperation, energy intensification, lower energy demand. And you see for 1.5 degree, your decarbonization, the energy really fast. And you also have investments into renewables and also CCS. So this is maybe a bit optimistic, right? So for a 2-degree target, so you continue with the fossil fuels for a bit longer, 2030, yeah? But the longer you carry on with the fossil fuels, the sharper you kind of have to switch the tap off for reaching 2 degrees. And there, you also have a massive ramp-up of biomass as a primary energy source. And here it is, bioenergy coupled to CCS. So you need very large investment into CCS, a lot larger than we're seeing in terms of current politics. Also, you have this ramp-up of renewables, in this scenario, solar in particular. But I also like to point out that nuclear energy is the 4th largest primary energy source in the last half of our century in some of these more pessimistic 2-degree scenarios. So within the special report, there is also sort of a recipe for how to reach the Paris Agreement. Here is some of the ingredient lists. Yes, you need an unprecedented scale and rate of change, but you also need negative emission technologies, CCS, renewables, but also changes in our behavior. So we need to have fewer babies, eat less meat, have more sensible rates of consumption, and so on. Global cooperation, we all need to make friends, be friends, makes a lot of sense, makes a nicer world of it. Adaptation, we still need to adapt, we're still going to see a lot more climate change, even if we manage to limit the climate change to 1.5 degrees. Land area is a huge puzzle. How do we feed the world and also provide bioenergy resources, for instance, and preserve nature? But this all needs to go hand in hand with the Sustainable Development Goals. It doesn't help to solve one of them. They all need to make sense for this transition to work out. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Helene, for a breathtaking 5 minutes. And now, Jay Edmonds, if you please. Jay is Chief Scientist at the Global Change Research Institute, and he'll now give us his 5 minutes presentation.
So I really like these short talks. This is a 5-minute talk to say something important. And rather than a tour through everything I've ever encountered, you have to think about what are the messages. And so actually, we never have to get past this slide because there are two really important messages, and they are that implementing Paris is an extremely daunting task. If you ever delve into exactly what has to happen and where, you come away just staggered by how difficult it really is. And the second point is it's extraordinarily important. And so let me just sort of elaborate those points quickly. The goal of the Paris Agreement is 2 degrees or substantially below, something like 1.5. So we just heard a little bit about the comparison between 2 degrees and 1.5. And let me just put this up. This is from the 5th assessment report. And this is a point that now has been made a couple of times during the course of this meeting. But if you look here, all of the scenarios that generate something that could be considered 2 degrees or substantially below all have, for the planet, more carbon coming out of the atmosphere than is going in. That is, if you think about it, it is just an enormous undertaking that we're calling on. And so one of the questions is, when does that happen? For 2 degrees, it happens here. For 1.5, it happens mid-century, so you have to push the timeline up. You'll also notice that the break here is almost immediate, that you go from a world which is increasing its emissions to a world in which emissions are decreasing, and decreasing precipitously. 2-degree scenarios, in fact, require premature retirement of physical capital, plant, and equipment before their economic lifetimes are over. And if you look at the build, the construction that is just been completed or is underway around the world, we're actually adding to the coal fleet, not prematurely retiring it. If you look at the sectors in the distribution, you'll see that everybody has to go to zero. I worked on a project recently in which we had a lot of really smart private sector people, so their goal was to figure out how to get in the United States, which is a rich country, lots of technology, how do you get to 80% reduction? And the basic idea that they had was that, all right, we got 4 sectors. We got power, we got buildings, we got industry, we got transport. If we each do 20%, that'll give us 80. And, and you think, all right, you laugh, and I find it humorous too. But these are really smart people that can make $1 billion in the time it takes for us to wake up in the morning. And yet, it hadn't really sunk in, what they were talking about. That, like marginal cuts will do the job. And no, that's not the case at all. Everybody's got to get to zero, ultimately. If CO2 capture and storage is available, the scenarios tell you that the power sector is below zero by the middle of the century and substantially below zero at the end of the century. That's where the negative emissions that offset things like non-CO2 greenhouse gases from ruminant livestock, from all of these sources that are really difficult to remove from the system. And you see those up here in the right-hand corner, and if you look at these are 2030, 2050, and 2100 time periods. If you don't have CO2 capture and storage, you still need the negative emissions in these scenarios. It just changes where they come from, and they come from the net change in terrestrial carbon, and so that's really an important element. So if the first point, it's really daunting. The second is that every bit of the way that you get there matters, and this is a figure that looks at the NDCs. These are a couple of reference scenarios about how the world could evolve. This is if everybody implements their NDC and then maintains constant ambition. And just implementing the NDCs, which, if you look carefully, we're not on track to do as a planet. If we were to implement the NDCs, it changes the likelihood of being above 4 degrees from more than 50%. You're more likely than not to be above 4 degrees in 2100. 2, you're more likely than not to be below 3 degrees in 2100. And so even if you don't get there, it's really important to make progress toward that goal. So those are my 2 points.
Thank you so much, Jay. And now for the fireside chat. And Helene, you, as part of NTNU's Industrial Ecology program, you were part of disseminating the 1.5 degree report when it came out in October. You met a lot of decision makers. How do you think that report has been followed up in the 5-month period since?
Yeah, that's a good and important question, because the way the report was received is like, oh yes, this is very important, and clearly we need to do something, but the level of action really does not match what comes as required from the report to really limit the worst effects of the global warming and trying to keep climate change at the safest levels possible. So action does really not match the demands from the report, and that's kind of ironic considering that the report comes from, as a, it was an order basically from politicians saying, what do we need to do? We need a recipe, a plan of action to limit climate change, and then they're not acting upon it. So it is quite disappointing, to be blunt, and the level of ambition and action really needs to be quite amplified.
Because the people in this room, of course, saw the report as, well, if the sense of urgency wasn't there before, it really came on that early October day. And do we have to rely on the market to deal with this whole issue? Will the decision makers not be able to follow the pace of knowledge production? And, well, as you see, the IPCC report didn't really get the political follow-up we wanted. It was intended when the report was made.
So I guess if you look at the climate issue, and for the last half century it's been the same, it is perhaps the most daunting public goods problem that economics has to work on. It is just a classic instance in which the incentives that the market produces don't incorporate this enormous intergenerational global externality. And so that goes unpriced, and therefore that is underserved. And so you ultimately need to have governments intervene to provide the incentives that correct this market failure. That's the bottom line. And so what you see, if you look around the world, what you see is that governments have been very slow to move to correct that market failure. I was hoping to get a chance to ask the panel this morning, why have we been so slow? You have the science moving ahead very quickly. You have nominal ambition. Every time the Conference of the Parties get together, they increase their level of ambition. Maybe next time it'll be to 1 degree, but then you look to see what the actions that governments are actually implementing are, and they don't correspond. And I think that there's a dire need for, if governments really want to do this, that they need to actually step up and provide those hard measures that will provide the incentives to deliver the goods.
So follow-up question then, because you're an economist, and it's all about prioritizing, isn't it? Where do we go first? For all governments all over the world right now, next week, you meet with your ministries, you do this.
Yeah, this is the question I got last year. And I'm going to answer it pretty much the same way I answered it last year, which is that governments don't have, they don't like a one-size-fits-all answer. If you look at the reason Paris was able to be implemented was that rather than do a top-down, all right, we're all going to do cap and trade. Rather than do that, it's like, all right, everybody decide what's the natural thing for your society to deliver. And so it's not going to be one thing. Someone said that they doubted very seriously that the world would have a common carbon tax. I have to agree with them. I just don't see that. There's nothing that we have, no evidence that we have from the last half century that there is a common global carbon tax in the offing. So what you're going to have is pretty much what you would hope for is more of and more stringent measures that societies feel that are appropriate to them, but they have to be hard-edged. And you have, the recipe, you gave the recipe, and the recipe is, boils down to pretty simply, decarbonize the power sector, electrify end-use sectors where you can, substitute if you need a liquid or a gaseous fuel, get one that doesn't have carbon, either bioenergy or One of the pathways we've begun to discuss now is thinking about hydrogen again. Can you take this natural gas resource, strip off the carbons, put them back underground, and deliver that into the system, and then have some negative offset for those really difficult, technically difficult measures that are going to be needed to offset non-CO2s.
Because, Helene, you're studying the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And of course, this is a global issue, but you have the nation-state economies working as barriers for creating a common solution. Where do we go in order to find a policy framework measure that will actually work?
That's a really tough question for an atmospheric physicist. So I think maybe Jay can have this question.
Well, as I said, each of these governments has to solve that problem themselves.
Yeah.
And that was the magic of the Paris Agreement, that everybody brings what they can do to the table. And at the table, you collectively develop through, say, the global stocktake process, a mechanism by which everyone can increase their ambitions. So you start out with a set of ambitions, you implement those, and then you take the next step and increase your ambition with, and that's the political process that was envisioned in Paris. What has to happen in each one of the places is going to be unique to that place. And I'm a researcher as opposed to someone who is in political action, and so we probably need to get someone up here who is in the political world to answer that question, because that actually is a specialty unto itself. That is, how do you actually galvanize political action to achieve important social ends?
Do I see little Hannah?
Would you like little Hannah to bounce into the room? Yes, I think little Hannah would.
Why isn't
someone
she
would like little Hannah to bounce into.
Why isn't she called Greta, by the way?
Greta is, I think, irreplaceable.
You talked about, carbon taxes and how it's unlikely.
Please tell us who you are. This is Nathan Meehan.
So Nathan Meehan, Gaffney Klein. You talked about carbon taxes and the unlikelihood of having that globally. The other tax incentives, the other sort of carrot versus stick thing is also likely to be uniformly implemented. But couldn't countries tax imports of goods based on their energy content and achieve the net similar impact? I mean, what you do when you unilaterally raise taxes on yourself is you make yourself less competitive, and you tend to export manufacturing to countries like China that use coal primarily. And that's at least what we've done for the last decade. So couldn't we tax imports based on carbon intensity of the manufactured goods there and achieve the equivalent of a global carbon tax?
Thanks. Before you answer that, can I just gather a few more questions and then you can answer them as it comes along?
Yeah, hi there, Aidan Cronin, Chair ETIP Wind and Siemens Gamesa. We've had a lot of talk about the young people and policy and whatever. We have the reality in most of the Western world that the population is graying, people are getting older. How do we actually motivate, because politicians listen to their voters, how do we motivate the older generation to have the concern necessary to focus the politicians' view on climate change as being a serious challenge?
Let's not start a Brexit debate again. Young versus old, wasn't it? Do you have another?
We can have another. Please tell us who you are. Hold it up to your mouth, please.
Hello. Yes, my name is Lars. I do impact entrepreneurship research. So I'm more of a believer of a bottom-up approach. So I was wondering, what is it that the governments can do to incentivize the people to kind of look at the entire value chain? So when they buy something that could be produced in China, that it could have been used, coal to produce that, instead that the consumer would then be incentivized by having tax reductions of buying something that is local, for instance, that has green energy sources and all of that.
So who would like to answer?
Yeah, no, I think part of the mood here, I think, is the bottom-up approach. So we need to listen to the young people, and I don't think grandparents are going to listen to the adults, and the adults don't listen to each other. But what it seems that they seem to listen to their kids, right? So this climate strike is an actually really important signal, and I think this is the way to filter the message upwards. It could be part of the way of making the politicians realizing that stronger actions are needed and wanted, and getting that message throughout the generations. Because yes, you need the voters. Politicians, they have typically a 4-year cycle, right? And that's part of the problem, because it is really unpopular to make those really expensive long-term changes, putting in policies in place that will make our climate better in 30 years. You know, you're not going to get elected based on that. So, you know, it's part of the problem, but politicians need to see that the people want it and the kids want it. So hopefully then the parents and grandparents will listen to the children of today.
So I'll start with the first question, which was one about could you implement a carbon tax in an individual country and get much of the benefit from it. And actually that is a really good point, that an individual country can implement a carbon tax. And if that is in fact appropriate, economists just love that because it's an economically efficient instrument. It really has nice signaling powers. If I were to actually fine-tune that, what I would do is I would say that you would implement a carbon tax with an escalator clause that, you know, automatically ramps it up. I mean, if you look at what it takes to stabilize, emissions pathways have carbon prices that rise roughly, exponentially, roughly 5% per year. And so then you have the leakage problem, and the way you can address the leakage problem, assuming you can get around the GATT agreement with it, is to have border adjustment taxes, and so that can address much of the leakage problem. And that allows an individual country to undertake that type of measure where it's appropriate. And so actually that's an excellent point, and that means that it's roughly independent of what other countries are doing. Other countries may have a different strategy. They may have a regulatory strategy. You could get much the same result, for example, if you had, say, a new source performance standard for power generation that said you can't build anything that has any emissions, and there's a clock on all existing plant capacity that sets the retirement rate, and you could get the decarbonization of power, and similarly in other sectors. So there are pathways to do it, and not everybody has to use a carbon tax, but if you want to use a carbon tax, there are mechanisms available that allow that to be implemented, and implemented efficiently and effectively.
We're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you, if from now on, let's say the school strike for climate actually works, and people start voting based on environmental politics and what will enable the green shift in a way that creates values, jobs, and we get to 2050. We have a carbon neutral society. What's life like there?
Hopefully it's a very optimistic place where we see that the solutions that we put into place are working, and we can look back and see, yes, we made the right decisions, we made the right investments into the right kind of technology development that we needed to at the right time. Because if we're at 2050 and we're in a carbon neutral world, then we already know how to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And if we're at that stage where, for instance, direct air capture, so you're scrubbing chemically CO2 out to the atmosphere and putting it into geological storage, if we crack that nut, then I think we're a long way there.
Of course, we landed on the moon. We're talking about how you can inhabit Mars. We must be able to make the Earth work as well, well?
Well, you know, I think there'd be 2 points I'd make in answer to your question. And first is that from an economic perspective, it would be substantially where we would have been otherwise. The total cost that we're talking about, if you can distribute the costs evenly across society, is within the measurement error. It's the kind of thing that, does anyone ask, should we repeal the Clean Air Act? Because I think the air is a little bit too clean. I don't think you're going to have that, and nobody says, oh, geez, this is a terrible economic burden. So that's the first thing. I think we probably, from an economics perspective, wouldn't even notice it as a society. Second is it'll be a substantially warmer place, and whether or not we actually implement 1.5 degrees, or whether or not we're still on the reference case by 2050. That difference, and I think you showed it in one of your figures, there's so much inertia in the system, and there's so much in the aerosols, because you're going to be drawing down the aerosols at the same time as you're drawing down the greenhouse gases, that by 2050, you probably won't be much different. The remainder of the century, though, is going to be dramatically different. By the time you get to 2100, you're talking about the difference between more likely than not to be above 4 degrees to having it, more likely than not being below 2 degrees.
But you both feel, based on all your expertise, that we have a fighting chance to avoid that?
I'm very optimistic about the technology and our ability to engineer the solution.
Yes, I'm a technology optimist as well, and I have to hope that we're going to make it, otherwise it's too depressing.
We're ending on a high note. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Jay Edmonds and Helene Muri, but did they end on a high note? What I took away from it was what they didn't say. It's like technology optimists, yes, but what about, we keep saying governments have to do this. Governments have to break into the market failure, throw this money at it. It's not happening.